Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Welcome back if you've been here. The Stoa is a place where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And we are back today with Bonnitta after a wonderful Hollow series. And I'm excited to be able to field questions and be able to explore this topic more. If you haven't been here before, I'll turn it over to Bonnitta, and then there will be a point where you can ask questions. Please put your question in the chat and just prefix it with question so I can easily see it. And if you like somebody else's question, +1, and that helps me see which ones to choose. So with that, welcome back, Bonnitta.
Yeah, so I don't really have anything to say as a preamble, except that the questions can be very specific to the presentation, or they can be just questions that arose in your own imagination while the presentation was happening, because it is provocative, like in many different directions. So yeah, and just leave it that open.
Great. Well, I have a question while other people might be thinking of theirs. What do we keep from modernity, and what do we throw away? And I'm specifically thinking of some things that like falsifiability and the verification powers of rationalist thought. And so if we're moving beyond rationalism as the primary sense maker, do we let that go? Does it get incorporated somehow?
Yeah, so I'll start with the biggest frame first and then try to make it more practical. The question itself has a certain temporal framework that we want to dispose of. So if we think of, for example, what did we keep from mythic consciousness? Well, we kept our ability to have myths, right? But we don't have mythic consciousness. To be a modern with a hybrid mind that has access to forms of mythology is different than being a person of mythic consciousness, right? This is a really big difference. So it's not like we can keep our modern consciousness and then add something to it. The whole is always moving, right? It's not like, so that aspect that seems like it came from modernity will still be different. So falsification itself will seem different in a new mentality. Just like the myths, the way we're mythological today, are not the way people were mythological before. And I always tell the story of my mom. She was a triage nurse in an emergency hospital. So she had to make really quick diagnosis right away. She relied on science, but she's heavily religious, and she would compartmentalize those things. Whereas someone of mythic consciousness couldn't have that whole spectrum of reality. So one of the things that, if we stay true to the hollow frame itself, which is an invitation to enter a frame, it's not the only frame, we have to understand that after the change, something like falsification itself becomes something different. What does it mean to have things falsifiable? So this Popperian notion of falsifiability is morphed in postmodernism already. So we have like this blending of what that methodology is already. It's an interesting question. What would falsifiability be on the other side of a bifurcation event in consciousness? It might be something like, I'm just going to throw this out because it's something I've worked with already. It's not exactly a good answer, but I talk about the change from judgmental rationalism to evaluative reasonableness. Can you feel the difference between those? So we could use something like judgmental rationalism to falsify something, which means I'm making a judgment through a rational analysis. I could use something like evaluative reasoning, evaluative reasonableness to falsify something. Is it reasonable for the forest to be cut down? Is it reasonable from the forest? That's different than judgmental rationality. So I could say those are both falsifiable methods, but what's happening to falsify or to validify is different, right? So what would make an evaluative reasonableness falsifiable? Would have to be subject to some kind of iterative experimentation, let's say. I could see that happening, but I could see rejecting judgmental rationality altogether. So, so the difficulty with a lot of this stuff is that the terminology itself shifts in a new context, right? So, I like to do the I Ching. It's divination. Is it divination the way people used to? No. And so I think that what do we keep from modernity? That's a modern mindset. The thing just shifts. There's no sense of, it's not a thing that you can keep and take with you. The whole thing is always morphing. The fact that we think that something exists in the past and now we kept it here is itself a kind of a static temporal framework. But nothing ever goes away. So the potentialities that have emerged in modernity subsist in the new also, even if they're not remembered technically. Was that an answer? I mean,
yeah, I understand. Thank you. Andy's got a question. I'd like to unmute yourself.
So how can we reimagine K-12 education curricular components and therefore the competencies that we want out of kids beyond the concept of time, change, and self?
Yeah, that's a very practical question. So I'm going to try to answer it from a building blocks, practical building blocks, instead of zooming out at first. If we look at a child, a young child, there are certain capacities that I would say are capacities of the core self. And I call them non-egoic potentials, non-egoic evolutionary potentials of the core self. So there are things like sensory motor perception and very fundamental things. So what we do now in K through 12 is we think by the time the child is 3 to 6 years old, depending on what developmental psychology you're working with, that the sensory motor perception system is developed. Like the eyes can see and the ears can hear and the body can move. But it turns out that at every stage of growth, let's say, the sensory motor perceptual system itself has to grow in capacity in order to healthfully support the complexity of the other orders of consciousness. And so in K through 12, we never go back to that. So let me get more practical. Part of what the sensory motor perceptual system has to do is organize reality into self, other, and world. We have some great early childhood neuroscience, neurophenomenology of how that happens. To give you, this is all very chunking, but to give you an example, very early in life, the child realizes that whatever co-varies with them is self. So at first they think the breast is self because it moves with them. But pretty soon there's, so anything that so they'll do things like this. Oh, that must be me. Anything that varies but has a marker of difference, like their mother responds to them, but there's a difference, is other. And everything that's resistant, that's not responsive, is world. This is a fundamental organization, and it's really cool how they work this out with their body. So that's the first mode. But when you become, let's say, a teenager and you go into puberty and you have an intimate relationship with another person, the concept of self and other has to grow again, has to grow out of this other. And then when you get into we space, self and other, and then when you get into some of these other reality testing things, what is the world and what is me? So K through 12, we should be supporting that progression of the core self. Because what happens today is people get to 40, 50 years old and they take courses like I teach and they trying to figure that out because it's been left behind. So we can look at transformative education as first, all the way along the line, have to develop this. Now in the West, we don't like to touch that because that seems like religion does that, right? Or psychology does that, or something that's not appropriate to public education. So we need to reframe that as, this is what we're educating. There's a core self. Then at a certain point, these are built up by layers. In developmental psychology, you get the sense that the core self is like this gross level of development, and then you get into these other level of development. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying the core self is a foundational structure that itself has a pathway all across the lifespan, that it doesn't then all of a sudden change to this cognitive self or something. And that's why we leave it behind, okay? So we have that. Now then around 3 to 3 years of age, these are always like the first age is when you first start to see it. The second age is where it starts to have its own momentum. Around 3 to 5 years of age, you have the communal self. So for the communal self, which is you start having relationships with other people who don't regulate your affects. When you're a child, your parents and other adults help regulate your affects. You can't regulate them on your own. You get into the communal space, you're like, oh my God, I'm crying, and my friend here is slapping me or something. So then you got to work this out again. But to work this out, to be a communal self, how do I have intersubjective relationships? How do I take turns? In order for that to be healthy and not just some kind of like rule structure that we give, that adults give children, we have to re-examine what self and other are again and again. So that has to grow to be a communal self. Then a little later on, probably much later on than we do today, you have the cosmopolitan self that has a bunch of skills that can be taken anywhere, like math. Math can be taken anywhere, it can be taken out of context, it can be taught across cultures. The communal self is, the core self is a deep evolutionary structure. The communal self is a somewhere self. It comes somewhere from some particular family, from some particular culture, from some particular language group. The cosmopolitan self is a go anywhere self. So math can go anywhere and science can go anywhere. Now in K through 12, all we teach is to the cosmopolitan self. All we test is to, we want to get there as fast as possible. this is a problem. Leave everything else behind. So you got a bunch of disembodied, decultured people that know math, let's say, or know how to, you know, do intersectionalist racism or something. So that's a cosmopolitan self. And again, the communal self has to grow stronger. You have to know where you're from in order to be healthy as a cosmopolitan self, or else you become a, you know, these people from nowhere. There's some book that has these phrases. Then there's another self. Of course, categorizing them as selves is a mnemonic or a rhetorical device for an educational philosophy, right? So this is a structural heuristic. You have the psychedelic self. Whereas all the other selves organize reality in a certain way, the psychedelic self is the disorganization of reality. The unboundedness is the loss of the reality of self, other, and world, or the loss of the reality of normative culture. This is also something that is a big part of the human condition, and it's a developmental path. And we need to be, that needs to be taught probably in, you know, there's reality testing now in K through 12. That's just the truth of it. So that has to be part of the equation. That's part of what we're teaching too. And then the content is the content is somewhat backgrounded here. The whole point is to like support this organism and these non-egoic potentials of these different selves. How we do that, or how you get people to do that, I don't know. You know, I'm trying to write that as an educational philosophy, but I think that's what we're supporting now, not just content. The part of how do we make good civic citizens, civic participants, that would come in the communal self part. You know, that's a core capacity in the communal self. Yeah, was that meaningful?
Yeah, that's
to you?
helpful. I'm wondering if, practically speaking, you see it as an after-school program that could be kind of supplementary to the existing thing, or a breakout group of parents with shared values, or a replicable rubber stamp kind of curriculum that you invent that can be put into various settings. How do you envision that?
If I answer that from a very practical and honest point, I don't envision it happening at all. There's a lot of pieces have to change for something like this to happen. And, you know, whether it's this vision I have or this methodology, maybe it just moves the needle. You know, I was in a symposium once with the philosopher Roy Bhaskar, who's dead now, but he was talking about the 4 E's: the environment, the economy, education, maybe the 3 E's: environment, economy, and education. And in this symposium, we were really working hard on the environment. There's more people really interested in the environment. And then of course the economy, and they seemed like undoable problems, right? And then he stopped and he said, education is the hardest one, actually. Like he said, it's easier to see how it could be better, but it's the hardest one to implement because parents have the say and they live in the past. And so you have to do something like, and I should know the name, not Rosa Parks, but you have to do something like Black people did in the 60s. They sent their little babies to white schools under police protection. Like that, you know, so it's a really hard because, or you see my own friends, they grow up radicals, they have children and they can put themselves on the line, but you get very conservative with your children. And that's what he said. He said, environment actually and economy is easier, harder to understand, but easier to act on than education. So there's a great deal of inertia in education because of this relationship we have. So when I take that into consideration, I tend to see my work as speculative, like always living in the speculative territory, like Whitehead and all these and people that have done amazing things. And maybe it moves the needle, but you know, I was talking about this on High Pitch. You know, we're talking about Maria Montessori was born in like 1870 or something. Nobody like. There's no traction in her work. And even people who are Montessori schools, they don't really get what she was saying, you know? So there's a tremendous amount of inertia in the system and a tremendous lag in transmitting some of these practices. And I think they will be taken up here and there. But in terms of mass education, I don't think it's a fit for mass education. It doesn't depress me, it doesn't stop me from being interested in doing the work. But when I get it to that level of looking at the world, that's what happens to me.
Awesome. Paul, you have a question? If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hey, Bonnitta. Thanks for sharing this project with us. A lot of really outstanding thinking in it. I had a question about when you're describing transparadigmatic thinking and sensefulness, and kind of described it as putting yourself in kind of the center of the solar system and seeing all of the related pieces. It reminded me a lot of Nora Bateson's warm data. And I was wondering if you guys had any conversations about those two ideas working together, and that they both seem to kind of put us in this frame of seeing the relationships and the context between domains that are usually siloed.
Yeah, so that's a real interesting question. I can't speak for Nora. We haven't had that conversation. And I can only speak from my own experience. And there's a sense that, like, when I'm speaking with Nora, we understand that we both have our models and we both have our language. And there's no attempt to trans-contextualize one through the eyes of the other, nor are we eager to map one onto the other. This leads to a question I wanted to ask on High Pitch, like what is the use of models? When are they useful? When are they not useful? How would I answer that question? There's a sense that this is going to be a funny word, but there's certainly some confidence that that our work is in the same direction and it's the right direction. You know, I have to go right now that I deconstructed progress. And that's okay, we just leave it alone. There's something very, so for me, it's like this, and maybe it's like this for Nora too. Whether or not how my stuff is related to her stuff is up to the audience, not up to us. I talked to Peter about this. It's like he was saying, should we name what the Stoa is? And I'm like, no, we don't know what the Stoa is. What holds the audience holds the whole, right? Like, so it's something like that, like not even caring enough to be able to observe the constellation of Nora's work in my work. It's kind of beyond that. It's kind of sacred territory. And it's more like an aesthetic aesthetic relationship. Like if you're, of course, Picasso and these other people, they fought. But if you're like really an artist, like a musician, I heard Bruce Springsteen talking about how much he loved Bob Dylan. He doesn't want to see Bob Dylan's music from within his music. They're just like giants that just, not that we're giants, but they just stand alone. And that's not really transparadigmatic, because transparadigmatic is always triangulating a little bit. You know, there's always like a triangulation trying to happen, instead of just letting it stand on its own. So it's not up to Bob and Bruce to triangulate their work. They can triangulate two other people's work. And you guys can triangulate our work, but it's not up to us. You can't be on the triangle and triangulate it at the same time. That's like a yellow flag is kind of what I'm saying. Does that make sense as a metaphor?
It does. I feel like what a lot of us are kind of experiencing is we have this growing network of sense makers that are all really advanced in their thinking. Sorry, I don't know what happened with my phone here. And that what we're experiencing is all of it feels like more siloed domains, more towers that need to be climbed individually. And I feel like at some point we will need to kind of create horizontal knowledge between all of these different ideas in order to have it become something that can be embodied and something that can create that kind of more shared participatory kind of activity. So I wonder, because I understand what you're saying, it's your work, it's her work. And in the I guess the modern kind of game A kind of ecosystem, what we are experiencing is kind of the same kind of dynamic of people creating towers of siloed work that is precious, that is protected and defended, which is, you know, I guess part of what the blue church metaphor has become. And I wonder if we're not making the same mistake.
Yeah.
In at least trying to find out how we can piece these things together into kind of like a meta vision that works.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. So, I don't experience Nora's work and my work as siloed or defended. I mean, sometimes we get triggered, okay? But in general, that's not a place that we're coming from. What I'm saying, but it's not the integration or the mapping or the triangulation. See, it's not just about us. Our gigs are we go out and we throw models at you. The whole community will eventually parse it into a new meme or a new culture or a new something. It's like, who made rock and roll? Not one of those musicians made rock and roll. Something merged, right? So this is why you guys who are not model makers but are listening and asking questions and coming from outside, this is the part you're playing. This is it's essential to the process. It's, you know, and I play that part for other things that I'm not writing models about, right? So you know, I can look at art or music or something like that, because that perspective is required. And people who have their models and want to own and defend it rob the system of that essential perspective that's on equal footing to the particular models people are hoping are helpful to a larger consciousness. Does that make sense? Like rock and roll emerged from something. Whatever is emerging from all these attempts to put creative stimulus in the field is part of it, but it's more than that. It's about the people who bought the albums and talked to each other about the different music, and created rock and roll was created by that whole thing. So that's how I see this. And in the past, like in integral theory, the person who had the theory was always trying to contextualize all the other theories into their theory and make the thing happen. And nobody else was allowed to comment on mainstream integral theory, because it was someone's theory. But that's not what these are for. These are like, it's more like, I see sometimes this work as, I like to paint with acrylics, and then there are people who are manufacturing really cool colors, right? They're not painting, but they're creating like, wow, this is a really cool color. And that's kind of what we're doing. We're like more like creating colors, keep putting it into the space, and then something collectively can emerge out of that. But it requires a lot of participation, gossip behind the scenes, criticism, reflection, triangulation, mapping part of some person's thing with somebody else's thing and making something new out of it. That's essential to the process. And in the end of the day, it adds up to more than the model makers.
Thank you.
But I can see how it looks like that. And this is tricky for all of us in this space to work like that.
Yeah, I didn't, and I also should say I wasn't trying to at all imply that the spirit of
No, I know.
Yeah, is in that game A kind of tradition of defending, the value of your tower, your domain. And I agree with you that I do think that the synthesis does need to happen in the community. And I think that what we're all wondering is how we start to begin to create the synthesizing of these models into kind of a bigger vision of how all of these ideas can actually work together. Because I sense that they can, because every time I'm listening to people present, I'm seeing how these different, isolated works are actually connected, which is exactly what you're encouraging with this idea of being sensible.
I do the same thing. Like I read all these authors and then I'm like, someone should, I feel that. Like, why don't they get together, create a school? And I feel the same thing. Like when I'm outside of a domain, so I get it. But I think what's happening, I think we're saying the same thing now. I think we know what we're saying, that there's yes, and yet how that happens is in a kind of different domain. And just by you saying, I see all these sense makers and it seems like it's integrative, you see that synthesis is happening in your understanding, but it's not explicit yet. So something's happening. Some stuff is going to be left behind because it's eclectic and peripheral, and there's going to be some kind of thread that moves along. Or else something like the Stoa couldn't happen. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff around the Stoa. How do we recognize that as the Stoa, right? I hate to try to make a meta theory about that. In the future, people will. They'll say, the postmodern turn, or rock and roll, or beat jazz, or, surrealism or something. Good question.
Tanya, you had a question. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
So Bonnitta, I'm kind of like overwhelmed. I mean, I loved your series and it's making, I'm trying to make sure that I don't bring up just almost everything I've ever lived and questioned everything. But I was wondering a couple of things. I have noticed that, I'm sure a lot of us have been in group works where you have to number off kind of thing and go into your groups of 1s and 2s or reds and blues and things like that. And the alliances based on absolutely nothing can become extraordinarily strong. And I find this absolutely fascinating. I mean, I don't get that at all. And I'm wondering if that is actually coupled to our sense of justice. And what does justice look like in this new reality that you've painted for us?
So let me just get the example right. So for example, you're in a breakout group, maybe the algorithm puts you in with someone, and then all of a sudden you realize, wow, this is like the perfect person to be with. Is that what you're saying?
I guess saying is think artificial alliances to be very strong, which you all you were was rounded off, and yet group one needs to be group two in this certain activity, or so and then you tally all these activities that you're doing. It just seems to, I don't even know these people, and yet here we are, we're all in group blue or something, and it's just extraordinary to me that these temporary alliances can evoke such strong group mentality. And I'm wondering if this is all related to what you were talking about.
What comes up for me is what comes up for me is this teaching I do usually when I work with the horses, and that is, so arbitrary alliances, like the connections are really strong from the get-go, right? Something feels really connected, or that you're aligned. And it seems to me that it's the case that everything is always falling in relationship to everything else all the time. So this notion of arbitrary alliance is actually the ordinary case. People are always falling into relationship with each other. Animals fall in relationship with people, the birds, and everything is falling into relationship with everything else always. So the question is, why do we feel isolated, in conflict, and disconnected? Because we're actually always pushing away. You start to see that most of your effort is pushing away, and there's no effort to be aligned, no effort to be connected, no effort to feel connected. Because the natural energies, everything's always falling in relationship with everything else. So you think about it is like, even when you're in conflict with someone, it's coming at you. That's a relationship. The bugs in your garden, the rain and the snow and the employee, everything is effortlessly making connections, and we're always pushing away. And so the fact that people can come together and be in a group, I think the structure of the exercise makes you just not push away. And then it's what comes together is really strong. My experience is that's the ordinary case. You can go out in nature and learn how to be present in a way that the wild animals come to you, and the squirrels come to you, and the birds sit on your head. And you've learned only to stop that pushing away, which is at the root of it, it's aggression. You just learn to stop that. You don't have to invite. That's a kind of aggression too, by the way. The invitation to be in relationship is a kind of aggression, because it comes from bad faith that you have to do something to be connected. And that's why it's a pushing away. That's a kind of aggression too. So when you understand that those two things are both aggression, you just get rid of those. And then you see the natural order of things is connection. That's effortless. And then you're at liberty, like you've got a pipe organ in front of you. Everything is connected to the things that make sound. But the thing is both to understand that the actual pushing away and the grabbing, they're both pushing away.
Thank you. So we have a little more than 15 minutes left. Bobby, you had a question, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm a little bit late to this project and what's happening, but I think you kind of already touched on what I was going to ask, but it's really aiming at incentive structures, right? And kind of thinking about value alignment and the challenges with the dominant incentive structures in the world today, especially for those of us that are deeply rooted in existing settings, contexts, right, where the people around us are from like an entirely different mindset, right? And I'm wondering, kind of, and maybe this is what provoked me with the work, and I'm like, hello, like kind of how do we provoke change in this sort of the existing incentives and values, right, towards maybe more of us realizing those relationships that you speak of.
Yeah, so context matters. And I think that you have to leave the context, Bobby. You ask me the same question over and over and over again, and that's always the answer. You just have to leave that context. Everything will be solved.
But then that context is, I guess, the part of
There's always a but, I know, but this is the same question. It's the same question. You can't, we're social beings, and in that context, it's probably not possible because it's recursive. You could probably leave and maybe come back, and then all of a sudden you're like a force of nature. But the truth is, you have to leave the context. It's not possible. You can't even ask the right question because the context is a hall of mirrors. Now, you may not choose to leave the context. It may be rich enough so those questions, you just don't let them bother you. I'm not saying which way it goes, but it's really, some of these things are black and white, and that's one of them. And it's a leap, or it's more the same. And if you choose to stay in the context, then try not to work so hard to ask why it doesn't change, but just tweak within it. But it's really one or the other. I can't be more that's more honest than that.
Thank you.
Okay, question from Barty.
Hi, Bonnie. Hi, everyone. So when you were talking about education and the core self and the communal self, cosmopolitan self, and psychedelic self, and you said it felt as though you were saying that I don't know if development is the right word, but that the core self almost gets stifled in our current education system. And I was wondering about that in relationship to this idea of, rather than sense making, but sensefulness, and if there's a relationship there, that if there was a nurturing of the development of the core self, if this place of sensefulness would be more accessible. And is there?
I think that's exactly right. I would map sensefulness as a capacity of the core self, and sense making is a cosmopolitan approach.
Yeah.
We all want to make sense the same way. We want the same models. We want to take that anywhere. We want to take democracy anywhere, right? So I would say that's more of a capacity. Sense making in a modernity sense is more of a capacity of a cosmopolitan self. We don't sense make our family. That's more of a communal, and our relationships with friends. We don't try to make it make sense. We trust it even though it's like crazy, right?
Yeah.
And the core self is more like senseful. So now you can see, as a cosmopolitan, as sense making starts to break down, if your core self has sensefulness, you can like surf this thing until something else. It's not such a disaster. That's why I started the course with like, modernity hasn't made sense for a lot of people, right? It's okay. Yeah, I would map it that way.
I had another question, but it left. So thanks. I know what it was, and it was like kind of our connection to nature, like being part of nature or being just a living organism. It feels like it's at the sensefulness is at that level of things.
Yeah. So the core self includes that, but it's a little more, it's also different than just our animal nature, because those categories, self, other, and world, change for humans, and they close out for animals. And that's basically the mistake we make, because we think that that perception is just, your biology doing something, and then once it's done, it's done. But humans constantly can reorganize their sensory perception, the context of their lived experience, and that often we do that work as adults when we go back to school or we join spiritual communities. But by then we have to go, it should be tended to all the way along the line. These questions we ask in consciousness studies, right?
Well, it seems as though that, you said the word work, like, do we have to work at it? And it feels like it should be a natural unfolding.
Right, except that what happens as we go to school, this is a school thing, is it gets atrophied because all the societal confirmation and support is for these other types of things. Right. And it's a false one, because you don't really become very healthy as a communal self. You don't really become very cosmopolitan. It's very hard, So yeah, they don't get reflected back to us by adults. They don't get supported or scaffolded. They get left behind. They don't go away. You can revisit them, but there's no intersubjective or cultural feed loop to them. And in fact, the opposite, you get punished. You get there's negative reinforcement for some of these inquiries that kids have or young people have.
Thank you.
Okay, Cheryl, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. My question is, I'm actually pulling it back up. My question is, how might Sensefulness scale? And what does it look like and feel like that's different from previous conceptions of what scale has meant to us before?
So it's interesting. I usually have an allergic reaction to that question. Like I got in a kind of a pissing contest with Jamie Wheel on Facebook because I'm like, it doesn't scale. These things are only local. That's like usually my go-to. But something different happened to me just now. So, and so what I want to say is this is how things scale in human systems. If you show up, you can tell, you know, I think this is different. So if you show up and people think you have something they want, then you start like their interest and their curiosity happens. And then if your students get a hit of that, then your friends will see, oh, she has something I want. She's more liberated. She's happier. She's more alive. She's got more energy. And then more people are going to want that. And it's literally scaling by this kind of very primitive, crude thing that people have of wanting something someone else has. And I tell a lot of my students this who are like coaches. I'm like, if you're going in every day and like just you don't have any time and your kids and you're preaching like how to be successful, like it's, you know, it's bullshit. You got to show up and they got to want what you have. And that's how this stuff scales. It has to be correct. It's got to be inspiring. And you got to show up as a person. Somebody wants some of that. It doesn't matter if that's you're sexy, you're handsome, you're silly, you're, you know, but it's got to be something like that. It has to have attraction. And that's how this stuff will scale. Hopefully.
Any follow-up, Cheryl?
No, that really does answer it for me. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. What I see in the chats is from David.
Yeah, thanks. Bonnitta, I'm curious, the question is, do you have a sense of the structural assumptions, the load-bearing assumptions within yourself that become apparent, you know, they're almost invisible, become apparent as the constraining context that gives rise to a new context to listen to in yourself? It's something I'm as I'm doing collective presencing and other things, starting to become aware of that, like resting in. And I'm curious if that's something that guides you. And it's just to clarify a little bit more, the movie Inside Out, I think, is a beautiful metaphor for watching that happen for a young woman as she becomes an adolescent. The structural assumptions of what is important shift in a fundamental way that gives rise to something new. And yet we think that, and a lot of people think that adults don't do that. You get to a certain point and you stop. But you seem to continue to do that. And I'm wondering, do you dance with that sense of places where the constraint is actually informing the next thing that you listen to?
No. No, yes, I do. A couple of things comes up. A long time ago, I wrote this paper on process model of integral theory, and I talked about view. Once you start realizing that whatever is real for you is in a context that you can't see, I got addicted to, like, I didn't care what was arising. What is the context? You're always trying to get behind yourself. So that's an interesting exercise. You got to be careful that you don't overconceptualize it and then make things that aren't really there, right? That certain types of minds, we can do that. So perfecting things like the felt sense, because you're trying to feel into. So what we did on the hollow is we got way behind our minds. Like there's these structures that are constraining or something. So what I can describe, however, is something interesting. So the obviously the content of a structure and the leap into a new structure is different all the time, but the process itself is self-similar. And I don't mean it as a conceptual process. You can start to feel like, I've used metaphors like, the metaphor of in between is one, but sometimes I felt like I wasn't doing anything and I'm not getting anything done, but I feel like a piece of clay that is being shaped. And it used to be the feeling used to be like, oh, I'm a loser, I can't get anything done. But now I know what that feeling is. And it's something is that this shift is going to happen. It's kind of like, I don't know, you're probably old enough. When you learn to drive a stick shift and you're driving one with the clutch slips, right? There's something like that. Like from first to second is different than second to third, but there's a self-similarity in the feel, what you're feeling for. So you can actually access the process that way and be gentle with it, because you can throw too much content in that's not real. But like the presencing, that's going meta on the presencing. You're doing the work and then you're noticing that you can sense the process underneath the work you're doing. And that will accelerate the transitions, because you I don't know why, I think it's intuitive why there's some kind of acceleration there. It's like a skill is being, that's something, you're not going to spend so much energy on that because it's already moved on. Yeah. And I think that's sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just creative, and you don't necessarily birth things that are useful. So you have to enjoy the process itself, because it's not always useful.
I know we're out of time. Do I have time for a quick follow-up?
Sure.
There's something like I'm noticing. I'm a big fan of Bucky Fuller, and something in the tensegrity notion of that, and the yeah, I know. the sense of moving from kind of a hierarchical scaffolding model to when the geodesic pops, and when the support is no longer, this is what I mean by the structural assumptions, is like I can get to a point where I can find that some piece is supporting way more of the weight of my assumption. And there's something I can feel into. It's like, oh, if I let go of this, I'm no longer actually being held down. I'm keeping myself from floating up.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to get a sense of, oh, like someone named it, we're into a phase shift here. It feels like with the election, and Brett Weinstein trying to bring in Unity 2020 and saying, hey, third party is something different. It's like, oh, this is a phase shift of a way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden it's like, I can tell this election isn't going to be resolved by the votes or even by the courts. This is resolved deeply by our participatory notion of what this means. So it's like, it's pregnant in the air right now. And it's a question, how does one loosen into trusting that?
Well, I think it's like checking your arrogance as a human being. At some point I call these things the God problem. Like if we could only understand how it works, we could make it better. You just think of what position the human mind is placing itself relative all that arises. And so, yeah. So did we leave you? Did I lose him? I don't see him anymore. Oh, there you are. You just bounced around. How'd you get over there? Yeah. So just something about understanding that you can't get behind 350 million people and think of if only people were like this, or that you could design human beings better than they've been designed by evolutionary history. This I call the God problem, like if I were God, I could do it better. So once you realize that, then a whole lot more possibility opens, actually. A lot of times when, like Elon Musk will say this, if you know that's impossible, then all of a sudden you've got all this you can do, because that's the ultimate constraint. So another way to put it is when you work with constraints is like most people will think gravity is the constraint for flight, but without gravity, flight would not be possible. So that's how it turns. The ultimate constraint is you can't change it. Hence, it's an enabling constraint because you can trust it. Anything that can't be changed, you can trust. And that's very powerful, right? That's very powerful. Okay, this was a great session. It went really fast. Now I have to get back to my class, but wow. Thank you so much for showing up.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnitta. Thanks, everyone. Just a quick question for you, Bonnitta, to set us up for next time. What did you like about this session, and what kind of questions or tone would you hope for in the next session?
I loved everything about this session, so yeah.
Okay, we'll do more of the same next time. Couple events at the STOA, Shadow Play with Aaron Rogerson and Alyssa Polisi. That is later, that's in a few hours. And then we have Subtler Sexualities with Kim Tallbear. And that is also later tonight.
Have a good day.
Great.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bonnitta. Bye, everyone.